The sun was high, painting the green lawn of vibrant emerald, the kind of perfect day you expect laughter and easy conversation to fill. But standing there, a straight line of khaki and serious faces, laughter felt like a distant memory. Officer Miller, the one on the left, adjusted his vest, the familiar weight of it a small comfort against the unfamiliar tension in the air. To his right, Officer Rodriguez was still as a statue, eyes fixed on the young man in the center. And in the middle of it all, the young man himself, barely more than a kid really, stood with a document clutched in his hand. His gray t-shirt seemed too thin, too ordinary against the bulk of their tactical gear. His expression was unreadable. Not scared, not defiant, just blank. Miller glanced at the beige house behind them, its tan siding gleaming innocently in the sunlight. It looked like any other house on any other street. But standing here, with the silent golf cart parked beside it, it felt like the center of something. Something significant. Something they hadn't quite figured out yet. The document in the young man's hand seemed to hum with unspoken weight, a thin piece of paper holding more power than any weapon they carried. Miller's hand instinctively went to his own belt, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his handcuffs. Not that he expected to need them. Not yet, anyway. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant chirping of birds and the faint hum of the golf cart. It was a silence that pressed in, a silence that felt like a question waiting to be answered. And none of them seemed to know what the question was. Officer Rodriguez shifted his weight, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but in the stillness, it felt loud. Miller met his gaze for a fleeting second. There was a flicker of something in Rodriguez's eyes. Concern? Confusion? Miller couldn't be sure. All he knew was that this wasn't a routine call. Not even close. The young man finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's all here," he said, his gaze fixed on the document, not on them. "Everything you need to know." The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Everything they needed to know about what? The question echoed in Miller's mind, a silent, urgent plea. What had led them to this quiet street, to this seemingly ordinary house, to this young man with his blank expression and a document that held the key to something? The sun felt a little less warm now, the perfect green lawn a little less inviting. The weight in the air grew heavier, a tangible presence. What was in that document? And what did everything you need to know truly mean? The answer, Miller suspected, was about to change everything. "Everything you need to know," the young man repeated, his voice gaining a fraction of strength, though still devoid of emotion. He didn't offer the document. He just held it, like a shield or a key. It was hard to tell. Miller's gaze flicked from the paper to the young man's face, searching for a hint, a clue. Nothing. Just that same unsettling blankness. Officer Rodriguez finally broke the silence that followed, his voice calm but firm. "And what exactly is it we need to know?" The young man's eyes finally lifted from the document, meeting Rodriguez's gaze for the first time. There was a flicker then, a brief spark of something behind the vacant facade. Not fear, not defiance, but understanding? As if he knew something they didn't, something fundamental about this moment. "It's about the pattern," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "The one you haven't seen yet." Miller exchanged a quick glance with Rodriguez. A pattern? What pattern? They'd responded to a disturbance call, a vague report of something unusual at this address. Nothing in the dispatcher's notes had mentioned patterns or anything remotely cryptic. The young man's words felt like a puzzle piece dropped into a picture they hadn't even begun to assemble. "What pattern are you talking about?" Miller asked, his voice carefully neutral. He was trying to draw him out, to understand what was happening. This wasn't a standard situation, and his instincts were screaming that they were missing something crucial. The young man gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "The one that connects everything. The one that's been unfolding, right under everyone's noses. It's all in here." He tapped the document with a fingertip. The dates, the locations, the anomalies. Anomalies. The word hung in the air, adding another layer of strangeness to the encounter. What kind of anomalies? And connected to what? Miller felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a disturbance call. This felt bigger, more complex. The young man's calm demeanor, his almost detached delivery of these cryptic pronouncements, was more unnerving than any outburst of anger or fear would have been. He wasn't acting like someone in trouble. He was acting like someone delivering a message they were clearly not prepared to receive. Rodriguez stepped slightly forward, his posture still straight but with a subtle shift that signaled a change in approach. "Son," he said, his voice softer now, almost persuasive. "We need to see that document. We need to understand what you're talking about. We're here to help." The young man didn't flinch, didn't react to the change in tone. His eyes, still fixed on Rodriguez, held that same unsettling understanding. He knew they wanted the document. He knew they were trying to make sense of his words. But he didn't immediately hand it over. He just held it a silent challenge. The golf cart sat dark and silent beside him, an inert witness to the unfolding tension. The beige house remained still and ordinary. But the air around them crackled with an unseen energy, the weight of the unknown pressing down. What secrets were held within that thin piece of paper? What pattern was unfolding? And why was this young man the one holding the key? The silence returned, thicker and heavier than before, a pregnant pause before the next piece of the puzzle, the next layer of the mystery, was revealed. The young man's gaze finally drifted from Rodriguez, settling back on the document in his hands. He ran a thumb along the edge of the paper, a small, repetitive motion. "Help," he echoed, a faint, almost cynical smile touching his lips. "That depends on what you consider help." He finally extended the document, not towards Rodriguez, but towards Miller. Miller took it, his fingers brushing against the young man's. The paper felt ordinary, just like any other document, yet holding it felt like holding something fragile and potentially explosive. He unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a single sheet, but several pages stapled together. The first page was a grid, filled with dates and locations, written in a neat, precise hand. Beside each entry were cryptic notes: energy spike, temporal distortion, anomaly detected. Miller's brows furrowed. This wasn't an official report. It looked more like a logbook. Rodriguez leaned in slightly, trying to see the document. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "The pattern," the young man replied, his voice returning to that flat, emotionless tone. "The one I told you about. It started subtly, little fluctuations. But it's accelerating." Miller scanned the dates. They spanned several months, starting with entries that were weeks apart, then days, and now hours. The locations were scattered, seemingly random places across the city. A park, a library, a quiet suburban street, even a roof of a downtown building. And beside each location, those unsettling notes. Temporal distortion near Elm and Oak. Energy spike detected at the old library. Localized gravity anomaly reported near the park fountain. "These anomalies," Miller began, struggling to find the right words. "What are they? What do they mean?" The young man looked past them, towards the beige house. "They're ripples," he said, his voice barely audible. "In the fabric. The pattern is the unraveling." Unraveling? The fabric? Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bright afternoon sun. This wasn't just about unusual occurrences. This was about something fundamental. Something that defied their understanding of the world. He flipped to the next page. More dates, more locations, more cryptic notes. But this page also had diagrams. Sketches of distorted shapes, swirling lines, and what looked like faded outlines of figures. Figures that seemed to shimmer and distort. "Who are you?" Rodriguez asked, his voice sharp now, cutting through the strange calm. "And how do you know all of this?" The young man turned back to them, his blank expression replaced by a look that was weary, older than his years. "I'm just the one who saw it," he said. "The one who started putting the pieces together. It's not a secret, not really. It's just invisible to most people." Invisible? Miller looked at the diagrams, at the unsettling notes. Invisible to most people, maybe, but clearly visible to this young man. And now visible to them. The weight of the document in his hands felt even heavier now, loaded with implications they couldn't yet grasp. The golf cart remained silent, the house still and ordinary. But the world around them, the familiar world of green lawns and beige houses, felt suddenly less stable, less real. The pattern, the anomalies, the unraveling. What did it all mean? And what would happen when the pattern was complete? The answer, Miller suspected, was about to be laid bare. Invisible to most people. The young man's words echoed in Miller's mind. He looked down at the document again, the strange diagrams and cryptic notes seeming to pulse with an unseen energy. "But you saw it," Miller said, his voice quiet.
"How?"
The young man gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I'm sensitive," he said, the word delivered without arrogance or self-pity. "To the fluctuations, the vibrations. At first I thought it was just me, something wrong with my perception. But then I started seeing the patterns. The way the anomalies clustered, the way they intensified. They weren't random. They were following a design." "A design?" Rodriguez prompted, leaning in closer. "Whose design?" The young man hesitated, his gaze drifting back towards the beige house. "That's what I don't know," he admitted, a flicker of genuine frustration crossing his face. "Or maybe it's not a who. Maybe it's a what."
He tapped the document again.
"It's like a wave, building and building. And the anomalies are just the foam on the crest." Miller felt a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. A wave? Building? This wasn't just about localized disturbances. This was about something on a larger scale, something that was unfolding and apparently accelerating. He turned to the last page of the document. It was different from the others. No grids, no diagrams. Just a single sentence, written in bold, centered on the page. "The convergence is imminent." The convergence. The word hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. "What does that mean?" Miller asked, his voice tight. The young man's eyes, which had been scanning the street, snapped back to Miller's face. There was a new intensity in them now, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. "It means," he said, his voice rising slightly, "that the wave is about to break. The anomalies are going to converge, to overlap. When they do..." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on something beyond Miller's shoulder. Miller and Rodriguez instinctively turned, following his gaze. The air above the beige house seemed to shimmer, not with heat, but with something else, something that distorted the light. It was subtle at first, like a heat haze, but it quickly intensified, growing into a visible distortion, a ripple in the very fabric of the air. The leaves on the nearby trees seemed to vibrate, not from wind, but from an unseen force. A low hum, barely audible at first, began to emanate from the house, a sound that resonated not in their ears, but in their bones. "What is that?" Rodriguez breathed, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The young man didn't answer. He was staring at the distortion above the house, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The humming intensified, growing into a deep, resonant thrum. The distortion above the house solidified, taking on a swirling, vortex-like appearance. Colors that shouldn't exist began to bleed into the vortex, hues that were both vibrant and unsettling. "It's happening," the young man whispered, his voice trembling. "The convergence. It's happening here." Miller looked from the swirling vortex above the house to the document in his hand, to the bold sentence, "The convergence is imminent." It wasn't a warning. It was a prophecy. And they were standing at ground zero. The golf cart, the beige house, the quiet street, they were no longer just ordinary elements of a suburban landscape. They were part of something else, something extraordinary and terrifying. The humming reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that vibrated through the ground. The vortex above the house pulsed, expanding, drawing the air around it into a swirling maelstrom. Miller felt a strange sensation, a pulling, a stretching, as if the very air was being stretched taut. He looked at Rodriguez, whose face was etched with disbelief and fear. He looked back at the young man, who was standing rigid, his eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was reality, twisting and contorting before their eyes. The pattern wasn't something to be read on a document. It was something to be experienced. And as the vortex above the house flared within blinding light, Miller knew, with a terrifying certainty, that their world was about to change. The final chapter wasn't about the young man, or the document, or the anomalies. It was about the convergence, and they were caught in its irresistible pull.